Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sabyasachi Majumdar. I basically look after the energy rating and research process and functions in ICRA Limited. I would like to begin by thanking ET for giving us this opportunity for moderating this very illustrious panel, I must say. I also welcome all my fellow panelists on the discussion, and we look forward to having a very nice interactive session which should shed some light on the 300 gigawatt target. Is it achievable or not? What needs to be done? What is holding us back? And basically like what are the capacities, what are the constraints, how do we do things right, what are the various technological innovations which are which could help us get there. So we will be over the course of the next 1 hour, we should be able to, I think my panel will be able to answer a lot of these questions. So I'll begin by asking one common set of questions to all the panelists here. Basically, the thing is, right now we are at a little above maybe 55 gigawatts total solar capacity, including decentralized generation, and we are adding about 10 to 15 gigawatts every year. So 300 gigawatt by 2030 looks a pretty stiff target. So my first question to all the panelists would be: is 300 gigawatt achievable at all? If not, I mean, if they have some reservations about it, what is the kind of ballpark range of capacities they're looking at? And what are the main constraints? I mean, in case, what are the main constraints? Is it that the absolute level of demand is not there to sustain the 300 gigawatt capacity? Or is it that, the way the demand is distributed and the fact that, storage is still not, viable? Does that put a kind of a cap on how much capacity we can add over the next 7-8 years? What about the counterparties? Are they capable of absorbing and paying for all the incremental investments which will be going into the system? Does the transmission system have the wherewithal to deal with all this intermittent power which is going to be put into the system? Do we have the funding, the equipment availability? I mean, the EPC capacity? All these things we'll try to answer. So first, I would like to address this question to Mr. Srivastava. Would you like to share your perspective on this? 300 gigawatt, doable or not? What are the constraints? If you can shed some light.
I mean, answer to this question, whether 300 is achievable or not, is something like the this religious theory of predestination. That whether this can happen or not. So I suppose it depends on our actions. With due respect to people who do believe in the theory of predetermination and predestination. So I believe it depends on our actions. The first thing is that obviously we have to increase the demand. We have to increase the size of the room. The first thing that comes to my mind is to have greater demand, industrial demand, which obviously depends on a host of factors beyond energy. But the important role that energy plays is providing power at lower rates. The cost of power in India is among the highest in most countries. And this is a big disincentive for setting up new industry in India, which makes industry unviable. So by having more cheaper solar power, which might not go along with the many other stated objectives of the government, by having cheaper solar power, you are reducing the overall cost of power, which would help industrialization and increase the total demand for power in the country. The other two areas which come to my mind are cooking and transportation. These are two areas where we need to use far more electricity. I've looked after natural gas earlier, and I can say that using LPG, a mixture of propane and butane, or even methane, which is used in the piped natural gas, which you get in Delhi and some other cities, is not the best use of natural gas. To be using propane, butane, and methane for making chapatis is perhaps not the wisest use of them. With cheaper electricity, we should be encouraging use of electricity for cooking. And the other is, of course, transportation. We need to be having a much more concerted focus on use of electricity for transportation. So the first thing is increasing the demand. The other is that we understand that this achieving whatever targets we have, or rather moving ahead. I mean, target is something like, a student preparing for getting 95 out of 100 marks in maths. I mean, I don't think you prepare for 95 or 100 marks in maths. I mean, you can work as well as you can, and then, well, depending upon your intelligence, effort, etc., you would get 100 or 90 or perhaps 95. So the point is that this cannot happen through government investment. Government has to facilitate through policy and setting up projects which aggregate demand and lessen private risk, the risk and uncertainty for private investors. That is the role the government has to play. It needs to play it more effectively. My interest in the sector has been, for example, to two projects. The Riva project, which of course Surbhi would talk about perhaps in as greater detail, where the philosophically what we did was only lessening the investor risk and uncertainty, which enabled us to get far lower prices than the prevailing prices at that time. The same thing we achieved in the rooftop. By lessening the risk for rooftop investors, we achieved rates which are far lower than the prevailing rates. So, without going into details of what was done either of these, the point is that the government has to take steps to lessen risk and uncertainty for private investment. That would enable a lot of money which is internationally available at very low rates, because then they would have very low expectation of ROI if they are investing in a safe project, to flow into India in the renewable energy sector, and also to enable them to get debt at low rates, which would cumulatively lead to lower solar prices, which would again tend to increase the demand and help the country, as I said earlier, by increasing the industrial activity in the country.
Thanks. That was quite useful. Ms. Sharma, the same question to you. How do you see? I mean, 300 gigawatts, do we get there? We don't get there? And what do you see are the main challenges?
Thanks for that question, Mr. Majumdar. Is it audible?
Yeah.
Can I be? Okay. A very pleasant afternoon to all, and thanks for that very interesting question. And I do agree and align myself to Mr. Srivastava's views. Now, when we talk of India, we are talking of India vision at 100 years, 2047. Where do we go? What are our net zero targets and so on? So somewhere I would say the sustainability, the 300 gigawatt solar that we are talking about is more like a North Star. All of us are trying to reach towards the North Star, and it's among the different stakeholders. How do we actually align and integrate that solar into the grid? Now, of course, recently there have been a lot of debates on what is the reason on, the exact 300 or the ballpark figures not being met. Now, there could be different reasons behind it. One is the subsidies, we know. One could be the demand. Now, again, it's very interesting that as far as the large solar power plants are concerned, India has been very successful where those ultra mega power plants are being talked about. Now, as a technology provider, we would always ascertain that when we talk of large solar, it brings along its own intricacies. How do we make it more viable? How do we make it more redundant? At the same time, it's interesting if you see the small rooftop solar is not being explored too much into India right now. So maybe, the ultra large renewables is what we have met, but the rooftop solars, which if you see in certain counterpart countries like Singapore, they are very high in number. But going down, you will find that even the implementation of these distributed energy resources will also come into picture. You will hear of the concepts of microgrid, even in congested areas like NCR. You could have a small battery system, you could have a rooftop solar, and so on. So there are, different initiatives that have to be taken. But ultimately, what is the correct mix of solar that we want? Be it large, be it distributed, what's the exact megawatt? Ultimately, we have to all move towards the net zero. And most important is, as even Mr. Srivastava touched upon, I think it is the energy trilemma that we are facing. One is the redundancy, another one is the affordability, and third one is the sustainability. So now we are no more talking about just power for all. India as a nation, we have taken a giant leap towards the energy transition. Now we are talking more about the quality of power, the safety standards of power, the voltage drops, how do you have lesser carbon footprints and so on. And also the circular economy aspects, where if you see what solar PV, where are we dependent on other countries for imports, how do we go about it, how do we actually move towards an Atmanirbhar, Atma Saksham Bharat, and we start exporting to those countries. So these are some of the aspects I think they are going to uphold, and that's where we as stakeholders have to combine the policy, the technology that is available, and how do we actually integrate it into the grid to reach the goal of net zero, which is the larger picture.
Thank you. So now over to you, Surbhi, if you can shed your inputs on this.
Sure. I think a lot of ground has been already covered by Manuji and our other panelists. My only couple of points are that I don't think that problem is about reaching the targets. It's about by when we will reach the targets and how. And how means a bigger or larger landscape where we talk about a lot of challenges which are associated with solar itself. First, of course, is its variable nature. So as we have seen that whatever targets we have reached so far, or actual installed capacities we have reached so far, they are still sustainable by the grid. But going beyond it, how does the grid flexibility issues and stability issues are going to be addressed becomes very important. So that brings the mix with the newer technologies like storage. And as CMD NHPC was saying, hydro is one of the technologies which has been there for ages, but how do we tap its potential? Battery storage, it has issues related to rare earth metals. Pump storage, again, some of these PSP plants have been already commissioned but not being functioning as PSPs. So all these issues need to be addressed if we really want to go a bigger step towards this target. Another important challenge which we foresee is that the standards and certifications and the quality of the products that are actually installed become very important. And how does that bring the pace of the solar to a halt or encourages it? It all depends on policy and regulatory landscape. So that I think is another important area which is extremely critical for the achievement of the targets. Some of the other which are smaller in nature but going to become even more important are forecasting and scheduling. RE projects, some of them are forecasting, but not to the extent that is required for its integration, for its, I would say, scheduling purposes. Government of India has introduced green markets, which I think is a step in the right direction because it promotes, bringing these RE projects which are under IPPs to the markets, deepening the power markets. But beyond that, what we have seen is that not many of the RE electrons are actually going in there. So how do we unlock that potential once we have these bouquet of options available? And why power markets are equally important? Because there are always these risks attached with the off-takers. So the distribution companies are already in red, many of them, not all. But how do we overcome that challenge? There are open access consumers which have committed to net zero emission targets. So landscape is quite huge. Demand is there. But then there are a lot of stepping stones in between which we need to hop before we reach this target. Right.
Thanks, Surbhi. And there's a very good reason why I've chosen Mr. Nandakumar to be the last of the panelists to answer this question. And because I'm going to flip the question around for you. See, as financing community, generally we tend to always look at the risk. We always are bothered about what goes wrong. And perhaps if they're from someone who's worked an entire life with a credit rating agency, perhaps I'm the worst of all. But the developers are a different breed. They are here because they believe that this market is going to grow and they are going to pull it off. So my question, I will flip the question around to you and ask you, what are the tailwinds which are going to drive India towards 300 gigawatts? I'm not going to ask you what are the challenges that have already been covered.
Thank you for that. I think very appropriate, and knowing the challenges is what gives you the strength to take these tailwinds to your advantage. So where I see, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why as Sterlite Power, we have chosen to go aggressively in this space of renewables. There's three things that I think are sort of creating perfect conditions for us as both a country and as a sector to make good use of. The first is India is far more interconnected than ever, right? And I don't mean it just in terms of physical interconnection. Roads are better, people can travel much faster. The economies are interconnected. There's a GST reform. There's a whole bunch of things that have made easier for businesses to interact. And lastly, there's a whole digital interconnection, right? The fact that the data networks and the data backbone in the country on the threshold of one of the cheapest data rates, right? Now, why are these three important? Because I believe these form the crux of us being able to manage more dynamic demand, apply more dynamic analytical and new technologies faster, right? So, today if we were to say, can I get data about all the renewable generation across the country on a cheaper data network? I think compared to when the National Solar Mission was announced in 2010 to today, you have so many solutions, so many startups, so many strategics who are able to do that and be able to visualize energy generation and think of how it can be distributed, how it can it can be used in demand areas. So I think first and foremost that is the tailwind. The country as a whole is far more integrated, which creates better managing of demand and better opportunities for us to deploy renewable. And not last but not the least is the transmission interconnectivity, something we feel very proud about. And in fact, this is one of the areas where a large market like US is struggling. The level of transmission interconnectivity to deploy more RE is far lesser than what we are seeing in India. And I think that is commendable how the country and the policymakers and the government are thinking about it into the future. So that I think is tailwind number one. Excuse me. Tailwind number two is we are at a threshold of and I think the minister also alluded to this, at a threshold of the start of the next increase of the energy demand. So we had a phase where industries had a tough time. Slowly, things are getting back into normal, and both the domestic and the international export orientation of the country is starting to go up. So naturally, it's going to require more energies, but this is happening against a global backdrop of a very sustainability conscious marketplace. So all the large procurers are saying, I want to be net zero. Why? Right? The reason being that there are policy and regulations in US and Europe that are going to require production and consumption to be very conscious, and is going to in the incoming decade impose costs on it. So this is a great time to be preparing for that, and for us to leapfrog and be competitive in that front. And thirdly, the fact that the capital availability for such large transitions, the combination of awareness and the scope of a country like India, the kind of capital scale that can be deployed is definitely much more, right? So I think we have sort of these three factors that we as a country and as a sector can are well positioned. Now, do we have challenges? We absolutely do. Are there some things that are core fundamental challenges that we need to address so that we can make really good use of this? Absolutely. But this kind of perfect storm, I think, is going to exist for the next 4-5 years. And that's something we should make the best use of.
Thanks. That was very useful from all of you. My next question is to Mr. Srivastava again. Madhya Pradesh government has been in many ways a pioneer in the development of solar power in the country. I mean, they took path-breaking achievements. One was, of course, REVA, which is very well understood by the market, and perhaps we need not spend too much time on it because the key learnings of how to de-risk a project have to a great extent been internalized and maybe have been incorporated in the subsequent bidding documents and all. But the other on the other hand, also you have this rooftop power. I mean, Again, record rates were set in terms of, low cost of purchase. And we are very privileged that, both this project, you were the, I mean, you were the brain behind both these, path-breaking developments. Maybe you could shed some light upon what were the, how did you go about de-risking this, solar rooftop project? What are the key learnings? And suppose if you were to be made the coordinator of a nationwide mission to, promote rooftop solar or decentralized generation, what would the key learnings that you would bring to the table?
Thanks. I would say that what I referred to earlier, to listen because rooftop, if you look at rooftop in India, it has usually taken the capex route. Now, most organizations don't seem to have the resources or the willingness to put in that much money upfront. So a very easy idea is to let private sector invest, set up a rooftop project, and recover its investment through sale of power to, let's say, if you would do it to Hayat, there is a rooftop developer who comes, sets up a rooftop project over Hayat and sells the power here to Hayat. This is a very easy model, which unfortunately has not been implemented very well in India. We attempted this model and we got huge investor enthusiasm. We got bids from all internationally rooftop players, all players in the country. We got bids almost 7-8 times of what we were aggregating and what was being bid out. And we got extremely low rates. And as far as the beneficiary is concerned, and they're very good institutions like IIM Indore or power grid installations in the state, national law universities, School of Planning and Architecture, etc. They have made zero investment and they make savings from day one for the next 25 years. So it has been a beautiful confluence of economic viability and environmental considerations. You asked me how we could do it. I would like to briefly answer that. Earlier, when it was attempted in India, so a SECI tender would essentially be one rate for, let's say, Rajasthan or Madhya Pradesh. Now, Rajasthan is a host of things. Rajasthan consists of the Secretariat in Jaipur, as well as a PHC in Alwar, or some village in Alwar. So, Rajasthan has a huge spectrum of things. So our tenders were more specific. There was a separate tender for government universities and, for example, a separate tender for government colleges. The reason being that a university is much bigger than a college. Its energy requirement is much bigger. The project size is much bigger. University is in a bigger city where colleges are also in Tehsil headquarters. So university, a solar rooftop project in a university would have a lower rate than that in a college. So we had a bouquet of tenders. In each tender, we had a different genre of buildings with one category of building and the same owner. For example, medical education department for all medical colleges in the state was one tender. All colleges was one tender. All engineering colleges was another tender, and so on and so forth. So there was a separate rate for each category, which is what the SECI tenders did not have. They had a common rate for, let's say, Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan. The other thing was that the buildings were listed out. So we didn't really stop at saying medical colleges in Madhya Pradesh. No, we said medical college in Shivpuri, medical college in Goyal, etc. These 7 medical colleges. So the bidder knew that if they win the bid, they had to set up the project in these buildings. Whereas in the SECI or NTPC Vidyut Vyapar Nigam tender, the winner of the bid had to actually go all around the state and convince the building owner to sign the PPA. Now imagine a dean of medical college of Shivpuri in Madhya Pradesh. Some guy walks into his room and says that I have won a bid of SECI. Now I can assure you, Dean Medical College Shivpuri would not know what SECI is. Now he would tell him that SECI is a PSU and they conducted a bid and I have won that bid. And here's a 250-page document, please sign it. I mean, the Dean of Medical College of Shivpuri would never have the patience or the enthusiasm to go through a 250-page document. What we did was, we identified the buildings, we convinced each department, we pre-approved the documents from those departments. So the medical education department pre-approved the power purchase agreement. So when they won the bid, the bidder had simply to sign the pre-agreed document with each with college. The other thing we did was that for each institution, we had a pre-engineering design. We had a Google image, and we had a pre-engineering design with the placement of panels, modules, looking at the trees, etc. So all that was put in our data room. So like our tender for government colleges was 206 colleges. So the data room had 206 folders, each folder for each college. For each college, there was a Google image with a pre-engineering design with the number of panels, modules, even the length of copper wire required. So all that information is available to the bidder sitting in his or her office in Noida or Bangalore or Pune. Just at the click of a mouse, they could see what is the capital investment required for each project. So these, and then the documents were such which, sort of had a balanced allocation of risk between the developer and the beneficiary over a long-term period. And we took a lot of inputs from the bidders regarding the documents during the pre-bid meetings. Our pre-bid meetings were highly interactive. Whatever suggestions came from the bidders, we incorporated them in the documents. That's why our documents took a long time, which they did even Riva as Surbhi would remember. But the documents were accepted very warmly. That's why we had huge participation. Clean Tech, a Singapore-based company, Mauritius-based M+, they all participated in tender, and the projects have been commissioned as well. There was huge hiatus in the earlier tenders of SECI and NTPC Power Nigam that there would be tenders, but their conversion to signed PPAs was low, and their conversion to commissioned projects was also very low. Whereas we had a very good ratio. More than 100 buildings in the state have been already commissioned, and they are making the savings under this.
So basically, would it be fair to say that gaining a buy-in from the end user and customization would be the key?
So I would say one is aggregation, and I think government is ideally placed to aggregate. And you talked about replication at a national level. So Niti Aayog is trying to replicate what we have done with the Pradesh's project to set up rooftop solar projects in health institutions all over the country. Okay. So I'm also helping them do that. So one is aggregation. The other, I would say, as a principle, is lessening the the marketing effort that was earlier needed for the developers. If you do the marketing effort, if you do the pre-engineering, which the developer would require to do, and if you have a balanced risk allocation, these I believe would be the broad factors.
Great. So my next question is to Surbhi. World Bank, does policy advocacy for, clean energy and all related aspects to it. So could you share with us, what are the things that, World Bank is trying to promote right now?
Let me butt in that apart from policy advocacy, the data room that we developed for our rooftop project was run by the World Bank.
Okay. So maybe you can
do
share
more than policy advocacy.
Yes, policy advocacy, as well as, what are the other strengths that, World Bank brings to the renewable energy scenario in India?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so ultimately, policy advocacy is our end goal, but we do a lot of things to reach that particular goal. So our basic objective, as you all know, that we are development bankers, and we have limited pot of money, of course, and the sectoral needs are quite high. So we have understood that what we need to do has to be very specific, where the private sector players are still sitting by the edge and hesitant to enter the market. So how we can come, absorb the first mover risks, and help open the sector for commercial investments by feeding through this engagement of financing and developing policy and regulatory ecosystem. So this is what broadly summarizes the principle with which we are working. So we started, for instance, in solar, our journey with solar parks, and Riva was our first engagement, which turned out to be quite a success. And then it was replicated in double the size projects in Agar, Shahjapur, Neemaj, following the similar approach that we followed in Riva. We did similar work on the rooftop, though it was distributed level, but still it was again a very good success. So we really need, first of all, the champions on the other side who can, take forward this engagement. And when we bring our expertise, what we also try to look on the environmental and social aspects, which become an ingrained part of our engagement. And to some extent, it really helps in reducing the risks that are attached to any of the investments that are going to come to the market. And international players have started to acknowledge that a lot. Now, what we are doing is that we have understood that there are a lot of demands going to open up for the renewable energy, not only in the current form, but also in hard to abate sectors like green hydrogen, etc. So what we have started to do already, looking at, for instance, green hydrogen value chain, identifying that where the pain points are, and of course there are 2-3-fold important points that we should look at. First, 24/7 supply of renewable electricity. So first is renewable electricity in itself, and then 24/7. So how do we bring 24/7 electricity is important. There is where we are trying to bring the hybrid models more into the center stage. With SECI, we are working on solar with batteries, solar wind batteries, also floating solar projects. We also worked on Omkareshwar, floating solar 600 megawatt, which has been bid out in first phase already. So these are the various ways in which we try to push renewable energy to the forefront, address some of the risks. Also, what we are doing on the storage side, which I think is becoming more and more important as we are looking forward. So batteries is something that we have already started investing in specific initial project with SECI, but going forward, we really want to push the market. So the way we did for solar rooftop, I'm sure some of you might be aware that we have a financial intermediary through which we pass on the concessional financing onto the market. The same model we are trying to replicate for battery storage market. We are working with NITI Aayog and a couple of financial intermediaries to see that what route and shape and form it should take. Having said so, we are not discounting on other storage forms, which is hydro as well as pumped storage. We are working with Himachal Pradesh and we are developing a very innovative product, so to say, to bundle hydro, which is in Himachal, to non-hydro RE somewhere else in the country, aggregate it through a trader or an aggregator, and then dispatch this bundle power to an off-taker, which could be DISCOM, which could be an open access consumer, which have already committed to go net zero. So in the first phase, we are looking at those off-takers like, steel industry, for instance, though not a good example for this bundle product, but just for an illustrative purposes, that steel and any exports of steel are going to be now under the ambit of European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. They need green steel, and they have recently issued some, draft regulations that whatever imports are coming to EU should all be green. So all these industries are very much keen to go towards net zero. So these are the innovative, I would say, interventions that we try to do. One more intervention that we are trying to work upon is to look at old and inefficient coal thermal power sites and which units are more or less about to retire or not working as per the merit order dispatch and have been there as dead investment, but utilities want to think about some alternate use for it. So we are trying to convert these thermal power sites or units as RE plus flexible centers, in a sense that they have transmission infrastructure, they already have land availability, how we can utilize that infrastructure to invest on solar. They have pondages for their cooling water systems, floating solar can be put up, they have infrastructure for putting up batteries, and also to utilize their generators if they have useful life after doing RLS studies and all, to see if that could be providing or can be converted into synchronous condensers to provide reactive power to the system, because renewable energy, solar, etc. do not have that mechanism to provide reactive power, which is also important for grid stability perspective. So this is how generally, we try to build the market, take the first mover risks, bring concessional financing so that the risk appetite improves, and then we try to feed into the policy regulatory ecosystem so that the commercial investments and the financial intermediaries are brought on board, and the sensitization is made so that all the stakeholders are completely aware of what's happening across the board and how they can probably start to think to come and invest in the sector.
Surbhi, question related to that. If we are really to have, that scale of solar power as well as batteries, wouldn't it have its own kind of sustainability challenges getting all those, rare earth metals, into the panels, into the batteries, what to do, after those are disposed. I agree it might be some time away, but we'll have to put, some thought into it, isn't it? So
Absolutely, absolutely. You have hit the nail right on the head. We are talking about batteries, solar, everything, and they are not being treated properly. So we haven't reached 25 years of life cycle of solar panels yet. So we are not looking at that problem, but that is going to come very fast and very soon. So we are already working with Ministry of Environment and Forest, for instance, on the battery side of the thing. Solar panels, recently some of the interventions, some of the regulations have come up, but on the battery side, we are working very closely with them. But this is a very important, consideration that we all have. So as of now, we are banking on the EPRs. But going forward, we really want that this sustainability aspect should be considered in its holistic manner. Also, I think what is important from that perspective, that the geotagging of these products become very important. That when you actually talk about, say, EPRs, how do you ensure that they are actually going to the producers? So that geotagging of the product, so that it goes back to the desired point for repurposing, or for that matter for second use of the equipment, are equally important, and we are trying to bring as much as possible on board. But very important, yes.
yeah, very good to hear that, Surbhi, that we are already thinking in terms of those. So my next question is to Ms. Sharma. What are the emerging technology trends in solar, in terms of hybridization, in terms of battery? So what are the exciting new things which are coming up in these areas, if you can shed some light upon it?
So I think this is one of the most interesting times that we are in, where the complete power value chain has changed. We see new players in generation till the distribution and the end consumer, and it's a pleasure to share that as Hitachi Energy, we are the pioneer leaders in providing all such emerging technologies. As well as power consulting, we are responsible of evaluating the different options which should be feasible. So, in one line, if I have to say, it would be a seamless integration, where we are trying to ensure that when we talk of different sort of energy mixes, making the optimal basket of what energy resource we are trying to utilize at that time, what is the kind of stability you wish to see into the system, what is that correct mix, or say how you would like to combine your large renewable with a battery energy, with a hydrogen, or so on. And in fact, taking a cue from my panelist on when she was mentoring on mentioning the data centers, as we know that sustainability and digitization is on high impetus all around. And when we talk of digitization, there is a new sector which is emerging, which are the data centers. And from an electrical point of view, if we see, because electricity is going to be the backbone of this complete accelerated energy transition that we are talking of. And when we talk of data centers, they are an intensive unit which would require energy. At the same time, the redundancy that they would require, normally from the power system analysis point of view, you would hear of a n+1 redundancy, n+2. So this is somewhere where we are talking of 4 times the redundancy of any normal load sector. So that's where, again, you have a high redundancy requirement. At the same time, you may be using diesel generators as a backup, which again, is not meeting the need of sustainability. So that's where we have to work out different combinations. Say, could you have hydrogen as one of the sources for backup for these energy incentive data centers? At the same time, when we talk of sustainability, that's going to be one umbrella which is covering almost all the sectors around us. And as technology providers, it's very important to understand that, as a nation, we have defined our goals. We are trying to add more and more renewable into the grid and so on. But ultimately, is the industry ready? Is the grid ready? Do we have such products and solutions actually which you could implement? And it's a pleasure that as Hitachi Energy, we have had a review of this in our own operations. So say, as a responsible organization, what's the kind of carbon emissions that you have? What is your individual carbon neutral vision? What is that own operations, the improvements you could do to reduce the carbon emission, as well as those products. There is a complete portfolio, or if I have to mention one of them, it's the iconic project, the iconic portfolio of products, where you would find that the normal GIS switchgear that you use, there is an SF6 free switchgear which is coming up with different components. So SF6 is very harmful for the environment. So what are the alternatives? Do we really have such technologies, such products which can readily be integrated into the grid, as well as reducing the carbon footprints? So nowadays, when we design solutions, when we design engineering projects and so on, we would also like to consider that along with your losses, along with your quality of power, what is that carbon footprint that you have? Say, what is the percentage of land you would like to utilize of the complete allotted one? What is the kind of, say, for example, the HVDC technology? We are talking of large renewables, we'll require transmission for the same. How do we make HVDC more viable, which would save, say, to give a ballpark figure, almost 50% reduction compared to the AC, lesser losses, and so on. But of course, these are the emerging trends, and it's the most important for us, as I said in the beginning, a seamless integration where the correct technology, the readiness of the industry, and the grid integration into the actual system. How do we ensure it's a stable one, it's an affordable one, and so on, becomes very, very important.
Thanks. My next question will be to Mr. Nandakumar. This is really, related to the capital cost and tariffs. I mean, we saw the module cost, fall to historic lows. And then it rebounded on the back of, what was going on because of the supply chain disruptions in China, their own, cost structures going up and other things, and the cost rebounded. But we see that the tariff trend generally has been only one way. I mean, there have been occasional, bounce backs, but by and large, the tariffs have been going only one way. So under the current, metrics of, capital costs and tariffs, are these projects viable? I mean, are the latest, tariffs which are being quoted, are they viable? I mean, as a developer, perhaps you'll be able to share something on that.
So, different developers have different levels of risk. So I tend to be a little bit more of a conservative developer. I think the real answer to that question lies in how many of those tariff PPAs are getting implemented on the ground, right? And nothing is better than the real answer. So, and why is that? Why is that the only real metric? Is because therein lies all the other aspects you're talking about, the costs that were assumed, what the risk the financiers, not just the developers, but the lenders are willing to take on the long call that they have to make. So I think while the tariffs have been going down, the rate of actually commissioned projects against those tariffs have not been at the same pace. So that, if I were to put these two data points together, and it's plain and simple for everybody in the room that clearly a lot of these numbers, that were assumed earlier are not viable in today's day and age. But then what is the, what do we look forward from here? I think that's the more important question as well. This is the past, but how do we look forward from here? And I think, in the age of competitive bidding and in the age of where we say only L1, there is going to be that pressure, and therefore the developers who can best handle that risk, whether they have a better understanding of future prices or they have hedged themselves or willing to take lower returns on capital, they will definitely be the people who will win in that. But I do believe there is another entire large segment that is going to play a very large role in this whole energy transition, which is not merely L1 based, but which is based on their own utility, which is the private sector. And that is where the viability will come into play, that in the current day and age, can the capital cost be viable for those type of consumers? And that's where I see more promise.
No, the reason why I particularly asked this question was that, as a credit rating agency, we rate a lot of these projects. And although the developers claim that, they are getting double-digit return on equity, when they actually come to us with their numbers, with their balance sheets and all, very seldom do we see the return on equity at being higher than the high single digits. Now there's a theory as to why it's happening like that. The theory is that there are zillions of dollars of funds lying in the international developed markets, which are practically at 0%, which are earning 0% return. Now the argument is that fine, the Indian rupee is going to depreciate by about 3% every year. I mean, which is a long run historical average. You can also build a 1 or 2 percentage points, for country risk and other things. So still, even if you're getting, let's say, 7-8% return on equity, still it's better than keeping the money there. Now, if this theory is correct, which may well be, it has an implication on who is going to be the developers. I mean, does it mean that the domestic developers, are really going to be squeezed out of the market, and with the large P-backed guys who will dominate the market, or let's say the hydrocarbon guys who are trying to get out of the fossil fuels and into the renewable energy? Does it mean that? Is that the implication? I would like to ask this question to you and also to the gentleman from the government as to how they look at it.
Sure. And I think you're right. The trend is correct. And why that has also happened is to the credit of the government, you de-risked a lot of factors. So there's a lot of capital that feels safe to come into government contracts. But the people with the access to lower cost of capital are certainly going to have the advantage in this, and that's very clear.
I would simply say that if you can have panels from outside the country and your mobile from outside the country, you could have money from outside the country as well. So I mean, you needn't have developers with domestic money. But I would actually agree with you that these days it is almost impossible to set up a solar project at competitive tariff with Indian money. Indian money is very expensive.
As you said about the third party.
Yeah. So but I see no harm in because if the foreign capital has been deployed in a country for a long-term project for 25 years, I think it's only for the good.
And Surbhi, what's your perspective? Because we need to fund those, and as a lender, we need to fund those, and we don't want the lending. I mean, the lending to be in dollars, because your currency is, your tariffs are in rupees, and if all your liabilities are going to be dollars, that's going to create its own problem. So, how do you see? I mean, can the domestic rupee debt market, whether in the form of bonds or in the form of bank loans, can fund all these 300 gigawatts of projects, or we need forex loans for that?
Yeah.
And how do we hedge against the risks?
There are a couple of things. First of all, on your first question, is that the tariffs, as our analysis goes, is that it's not going to come down in next 18 to 24 months, given the crisis and the rare earth supplies and other issues like forced labor, etc., which have been come to the forefront for the production of solar panels itself. So next 18 to 24 months, we are, at least our internal analysis reveals that it will be pretty upwards, not coming down to the levels which were there before that. On the financial instruments, I would say that there are a lot of innovative models that need to be deployed. For instance, build and flip, for example, which has been done in road sector, could be one way to unlock the potential and rotate the money, right? That you build and then you flip over to the private sector wherever you have risk, and then you keep doing that, and then you circulate the money higher. But yes, I'm versus dollar loans, I think, and the dollar bonds are important. I know that he's standing, okay. So yeah, this has to be much more, in sync with what RBI and regulations, and later on, SEBI and others also come into the picture to some extent in terms of how you float your index, etc. So all that will become important.
There's one elephant in the room we have not discussed yet, and that's discom finances. I mean, I've been a power sector analyst since 2001, and just after I took over this portfolio, we had this multi-xing idea and securitization and all that. But the point is, every 5 years, 7 years, we seem to again get into a kind of a liquidity trap. Then you have, Uday, you have all this, FRP and all that. And it seems that every 5 years, again, we tend to get into a liquidity mess. So, this question is addressed to, Mr. Srivastava, because he's from the government side. So, I mean, what do the state governments really need to do? I mean, how do we get out of this, vicious cycle of, revenues not being adequate for the cost, and repeatedly getting into this kind of a liquidity trap. Because that is, see, as we said, even at 7% return on equity, foreign investors will be there. But what could push them away is if they don't get paid in time. So how do we address that?
I would agree that this is a fundamental problem. With the low rates of return that RE projects are getting, the whole thing goes haywire if the payment is delayed. But to address the DISCOM issue, I've myself been the chairman of DISCOMs for 3 years. So I've been on that side as well. I would say a lot of problem is within the DISCOMs. So very often we tend to point fingers at others. For example, DISCOMs are very often in the habit of pointing fingers at increasing impact of renewable energy. But I would say that the impact of renewable energies is still minuscule. The problems are more internal, and frankly speaking, it is actually an issue, wider issue of governance. The more well-governed an area is, all functionalities of the government perform well. The collection of DISCOMs is better, and the health parameters are better. The IMR, MMR would be better, and there would be, the schools would run properly, and there would be no organized cheating in the board exams. So you pick up any part of the country, if there is a failure on one, there is a failure on all parts. So it is a fundamental issue, is the inability of governance, which manifests itself in poor performance of DISCOMs. That is why various states have various ways in which the DISCOMs are performing, and even within the states, the various parts of the state. For example, I've been in Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh, the west part is supposedly more well governed. So DISCOM is better. The IMR, MMR is better. You have never heard of organized cheating in the board exams. Go to the Goyal area, which is famous for films like Pan Singh Tomar, etc. People who have heard of Chambal and such things. So that is the area where the DISCOM is in the worst shape. There is an organized, often cheating in board exams. Health facilities are poor. IMR, MMR is poor. Law and order is bad. Illegal sand mining is more. So the basic point is lack of, it's failure of governance which manifests itself in that. The other issue is, of course, that the regulators very often have tariffs which are unviable and not fair enough for the DISCOMs. The other issue is that state governments delay passing on the subsidy to the DISCOMs. There is a delay there. There is also reasons which are not there, which are discussed in conferences like this. One is to say that because there is more subsidy. Now, that frankly is not the reason. Because if there is more subsidy, that ensures that the government is giving that part of the money. So, having very often people say, editorials talk about subsidized power being the cause of DISCOM losses. It's an absolutely incorrect reason. Subsidized power only means that the government is paying on behalf of the farmer. And government pays better than the farmer. There might be delay, but it pays, the farmer doesn't really pay that much. So subsidized power is not the cause, but I suppose these are the causes. So we need to look inwards. Governments have to play a greater role. For example, I get a chance to speak to young civil servants very often. So very often people in Masuri Academy ask us that how can this be addressed? So I think the biggest role that young civil servants, for example, can play is to, take power theft as theft. Power theft is not considered theft. I mean, there is a film, if you've seen the, what's it called? Katiyabaz. There's a film that was made by, so it's Katiyabaz. It's actually this, that, there is power theft is not considered theft. It's considered just a departmental problem. So
of course, long before Katiyabaz, there was overload by Arthur Haley. So I think you make a very interesting point that, it's not just about private sector reform. It's a broader, spectrum of socio-economic and political governance. I think that's a very interesting point. So it's not like, we can rely upon a silver bullet like DBT or just privatization. I think the broader, reforms and changes in governance are required.
I would say privatization addresses it substantially, because whatever are the dysfunctions of government, they don't translate to a private sector doing the same thing. See, for a customer, because the regulator fixes the tariff even in the private, run DISCOM. So if a paying customer, there is no impact whether it's a private DISCOM or a franchisee or the government, DISCOM. But it makes a difference to the non-paying customer. If you're stealing power, then the Sarkari DISCOM is allowing it, where the private DISCOM would not allow it. So it is only people who are either not paying or are stealing power who are the biggest, the loudest opponents of privatization. Unfortunately, the democratic system acknowledges that, and the dysfunction of democracy is that these voices get sometimes undue prominence.
Okay. No, the reason I raised the issue of privatization was that the successful models of privatization have all been the urban areas, whether it is Ahmedabad Electric or Delhi or Calcutta CSC or Bombay, whereas we didn't really have sustained privatization in the rural areas. And one example I can think of is Odisha, which has not really worked out very well, not with the previous. Maybe let's see how the current incumbent turns it around. So Surbhi, you would like to share your perspective on this, whether privatization can be a panacea for power sector reforms or is something more?
Yeah, so privatization, of course, can be the solution depending on the models that we are, trying to depute. There are lots of models within privatization also. So which one is suitable for which condition and which distribution company and which state they are, so that it's attractive for private players also to come on board, makes an important, consideration. So of course, depends on, again, I also am not heavy proponent that every public sector DISCOM should be privatized. It should be selective basis depending on where public sector inherently has challenges to, bring on board the distribution challenges or overcome those challenges.
That's all the questions I had, for the panel. If someone from the audience wants to ask any of the panelists.
We'll take just about one question in interest of time. Can I have a mic being passed on to the gentleman there? Or I think, would you want to scream a question out? No, you cannot. Sorry, I'll pass the mic to you.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Ashish Pradhan from Macrosity Tailwinds. So my question is, we're talking about 300 gigawatt of solar energy.
Sorry, but can you just put the mic a little more closer?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So how are you looking at the coal generation mix in the future? It is
See,
increasing.
we're not able to hear you clearly. If you could just speak a little more slow, keep the mic a little more close, like the way I'm keeping it. Maybe just read it out slowly.
So we are talking about 300 gigawatt of solar energy in the future. How are we looking at the coal? We can't ignore that in coal in India. So how are you looking at it in our generation mix?
Very interesting question. Vignesh, do you want to take that first?
So, if I can rephrase, your question is, what is the role coal will play as more and more solar and wind come into the system, right?
Yes.
Is that the right question you're trying to ask?
Yes.
Yeah. So, we are building a very large decarbonization platform focused on hard to abate industries, and our understanding is this: coal is not going away tomorrow. Coal is not going away in 10 years. But what are we trying to do? We are trying to do two things. There is a role different forms of energy will play, and I think it'll be at least one, maybe two lifetimes of before we see coal completely shut down. I don't think the idea is to say coal should be completely shut down. The idea is to say, can coal play a complementary role? Because whatever coal we are taking out of the earth, we are going to burn and not going to put it back into the earth till new technologies come. So can we make it more sustainable? Can we accelerate the adoption of other sustainable energies so that coal becomes a balance to what we can get from other sustainable energies? So in our view or in our worldview, we are not thinking of saying, make it zero coal. What we are thinking of saying is keep reducing the coal for the foreseeable 30, 40, 50 years, because there's also the 1.52 degree challenge that we have. But accelerate the adoption of other sources. And we are doing this. We have, with our group customers, we have 7 gigawatts of thermal plant, and the RE I am designing is meant to reduce the consumption of coal in those from by 20% in the next 5 years, and that is a huge achievement, right? So we are not saying do away with coal, because RE is still intermittent. There are still challenges. We need to balance the grid, but the realistic approach is to say accelerate other sources of energy and keep reducing coal. But don't think of this as there's a switch one day and then tomorrow coal is not going to be a part of the mix at all.
So if we talk about now, coal is around more than 60% in our generation mix. So if you talk that 20% down from that, so it's still 40%. How we can cater that in our COP26 or like that in the global platform?
But I would say that I would agree with him, but I would say rephrase it like this: that yes, it's absolutely correct that coal is not getting over tomorrow, and coal is neither getting over only when coal is getting over. So we would stop using coal not because the coal has run out, but because there are cheaper alternatives available. So as of now, I have myself a problem with the green committed enthusiasts who say that anything coal is evil. So I myself have problem with that, and I would say as of now we should have a smarter thing of using more solar during the day and using coal in the night, rather than aiming necessarily for a 24/7 renewable energy. I think it makes more sense to have a balanced use of coal and solar. And as solar plus storage becomes cheaper than coal, then automatically people would stop using coal. So frankly, this announcement of 2070 is might not be relevant, because it's possible that by then, I mean, it's almost like, someone announcing in 1850 that in 150 years we would stop using bullock carts. So, I mean, it was not really essential, because by that time it became, who uses bullock carts and otherwise? Imagine there was an announcement that bullock carts would be used on such, it would not really matter that much. So I'm sure that by that time, it would actually not make sense to use coal, unless you are a romantic at heart who wants to visit a coal-based power plant. But one should always respect the emotions that way. But otherwise, I don't think it might make sense anymore. So we have to work for that. How to bring down the cost of coal plus storage. So rather than this obsession with targets, we should focus on actions. In India, we have this huge feeling of being especially entitled, that we set targets and close our eyes and targets would come to us. So it is, as I was saying earlier, that we have this habit of focusing on getting 93.5% in maths. So there is no point doing that. Let's work hard on maths. Let's enjoy maths. We might get 100, we might get 90. But you can't focus on 93.5% marks in maths and get 93.5%. So we should focus on actions rather than supposed targets many years down the line.
Thank you.